In front of 200 of the most powerful people in the world, Queen Camilla hit a royal guard across the face because she thought he was being rude to her. But this guard wasn't guilty of what she said. What happened after the king finally got up didn't just clear the guard's name, it changed the kingdom for good. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from before we tell you what the king said, because what you're about to find will make you shiver. When you walked into the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, you felt like there was a weight on your chest. Ceilings were covered in gold, and crystal chandeliers hung from them. The drops of their faceted crystals cast golden light over walls that were lined with mirrors that had mirrored power for hundreds of years. It felt like that weight was heavier tonight than usual. The long dining table was set up under arrangements of silver candelabras. Each flame was burning steady because of the ceremony going on around them. Soft melodies were played on violins from the gallery above, mixing with the steady clink of crystal and the low murmur of polite talk. The French group was on the northern side, and their navy sashes and medals stood out. There were some of Britain's most famous politicians, military leaders, and cultural figures sitting across from them. Their names were written in history books. Each seat had someone whose appearance had been planned. The waiters were very precise as they came and went between meals. As the waves of conversation went up and down, French and English words and sentences mixed over the tablecloth like diplomatic music. Corporal Elias Wetherford of the Coldstream Guards stood still as a piece of cut marble on the eastern side of the royal days. Even in a room full of powerful people, he stood out. He was 6 feet tall, dressed in red wool that sparkled under the chandeliers, and his brass buttons were polished so bright they looked like mirrors. A pale scar ran along his chin. It was a reminder of the battle in Helmand Province that killed 3 of his friends. He had scars on his body from service, where following rules meant staying alive, not looking good. In that fancy hall, Elias was the only one who really knew the difference between ritual and real life. He felt comfortable with the weight of the gun in his hands, even though it didn't have any bullets in it tonight. His feet knew the exact angle of attention, and his shoulders knew the exact set needed for formal bearing. But his eyes still kept the alertness that kept him breathing through 3 tours in Afghanistan. What confused him was where he was put tonight. In the past, guards would stand outside these events as sentinels against any dangers that might be hiding in the dark. They were almost never inside, close enough to hear the silverware clink and pick up bits of conversations about trade deals and cultural exchanges. Still, he was standing less than 20 feet away from where the King and Queen Consort were hosting the most important dinner of the season for Britain. The task had come down through unusually clear channels, not just a formal detail, but also an inside placement, the eastern dais for the whole thing. He was given orders that put him in a place where he could see everything, while it looked like he was seeing nothing. There was no way for him to know that Queen Camilla saw him as a charge. She had seen him early, before the first course came out, and before the French minister started reading from his prepared speech about how friendly their countries have been for hundreds of years. She could feel his eyes on her every time she raised her crystal glass or leaned in close to a minister to say something. He wasn't looking at her directly. His control was too good for that, but he was set up so that whenever she moved, it would cross his line of sight. She wasn't sure how to describe how it made her feel. The way he stood made her think of opinions she didn't want to remember, and questions she had worked hard for years to make sure would never be asked in public. When she leaned toward the helper sitting 2 seats down, her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Why is he positioned there? Reginald Morrison, her aide, was a professional diplomat who had lived in 3 different royal households and knew when to speak and when to be quiet. He carefully followed her gaze. Ceremonial detail, Your Majesty. The household division requested additional interior presence for tonight's dinner. Additional presence. The words were short and sharp when they came out. It appears to me that he's watching. Morrison didn't say anything. After 30 years of service, he knew that some statements were better not made, especially when they came with the kind of tension he could hear in the Queen Consort's voice. King Aldrich was having a deep talk with the French ambassador across the table. He was telling the ambassador a story about a vineyard from his childhood. His voice had that kindness that he saved for times when he needed to be truly charming. He talked about how the morning light came through grape leaves, and how people talked about the land and the weather. It was the kind of story that made important people from other countries feel like they were seeing something real, which is exactly what Aldrich wanted. He didn't notice that his wife's posture was getting stiffer, or that her answers to conversations around her were becoming more robotic. His full attention stayed on building the kind of relationship that would make tomorrow's talks about environmental projects and cultural exchange programs go more smoothly. However, Elias saw everything. Reading under a lot of stress in rooms where getting it wrong could be deadly for years, developed senses that most people never get to develop. Corporal Elias Wetherford could see that the Queen Consort was uncomfortable as clearly as a smoke warning, even though he didn't show any signs of being aware. Though his body stayed perfectly still for the ceremony, he could see that she was looking at him more and more often. He could also see how her fingers were tapping quietly on her water glass, and how the tightness around her eyes suggested that she wasn't just diplomatically stressed. That particular mix of anger and unease had happened to him before, usually in people who thought someone was watching them and knew more than they wanted to know. He felt bad about being recognized, but he couldn't say why. He was only there for the ceremony. He was a reminder of custom and a sign of continuity. Even so, she kept having the sense that his presence meant something different to her than it did to everyone else. It wasn't the normal connection between the royal family and house staff. There was something that made her see danger where others saw tradition. The first course ended without a hitch. As quickly as they came, the silver plates went away, and were replaced by crystal bowls holding what looked like a light consommé, and decorated with herbs that were probably grown in the palace gardens. The French group made sounds of thanks. The British leaders gave a thumbs up. Everything went according to the careful plan that was used for these kinds of events. On the inside, though, something was building up pressure like steam in a closed tank. By the time the second meal came around, Camilla was more than just irritated. Her answers to people were becoming more and more automatic, and her smile was becoming more and more forced. Many times she looked at the eastern wall, which made other guests look at her with interest. 3 seats away, the wife of the French minister leaned toward her companion and made a comment in a whisper that would later be repeated in diplomatic circles. "The Queen Consort seems rather tense this evening." It was the kind of word that diplomatic partners were taught to pay attention to and remember, the kind of information that could come up in future talks. Elias didn't move, but his trained senses picked up on the small changes in the way the room was moving. The conversations that had been easy for the first hour were now becoming stiff and forced. Guests could feel the anxiety coming from the royal table, but most of them were too polite to say anything about it. He had seen similar things happen in the military, the rising tension before things got out of hand. Most of the time there were warning signs and chances to calm things down, but in this place with all the crystals and ceremonies, the usual safety valves didn't seem to be there. Protocol said that everyone had to stay calm at all times, even if there were underlying problems. That plan was going to be put to the test in a way that none of them saw coming. Camilla lost her cool just as the third course was being brought out. It started quietly, with a clink that wasn't quite right as she put down her fork, and a look at Corporal Elias Wetherford that went on for too long. The French Minister of Culture was telling a story about fixing up a chateau. His words were bouncing around the table in a way that would have usually gotten people to pay attention. He or anyone else was no longer heard by Camilla, though. Her attention had been drawn to the red figure that stood so still that he looked like he was made of stone. His unwavering discipline, his unwillingness to move or fidget, or his failure to notice how tense she was getting, all of it made her feel like he was being rude and challenging her authority. She started breathing less deeply. Her hands got stronger as they gripped the edge of the table. The dinner went on around her in a stately way, but she felt more and more separate from it, like the formality was something she was seeing from the outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was so clear that it cut through the other talks like a knife through silk. "You, meaning..." The one word stood out very clearly against the marble and gold. Talking stopped in the middle of a sentence. The forks stopped partway to the mouths. There were a few more notes played by the string quartet in the gallery, before there was a strange quiet. Everyone in the ballroom turned to follow her look until they found the still figure in red, who had suddenly become the center of attention around the world. Elias did not do anything. He kept his body in perfect ceremonial pose, and his eyes fixed ahead, as if the Queen Consort's words were just another sound in the background. Years of military training had taught him that being still was often the best thing to do, that polite silence could calm down situations where words would only make things worse. But the fact that he was still seemed to make her even more angry. "You are staring at me," she said, and the room went quiet. "Do you think that's protocol, Corporal?" Everyone in the room took a deep breath at the same time. Foreign leaders looked at each other in ways that would be seen by spy services for weeks to come. British officials were suddenly very interested in their plates because they didn't want to be seen watching what seemed like a breakdown happen live. Elias didn't say anything. Responding would mean breaking the rules that made him who he was and what his job was. The scarlet uniform he wore was worn by troops who had stood at attention as empires rose and fell around them for 350 years. That chain would not be broken by him. His quiet, on the other hand, seemed to fuel whatever fire she already had. Camilla leaned forward and her chair scraped against the marble floor. Her voice got higher as she got more angry. "Well, I asked you a question. Do you intend to ignore me in my own hall?" The French ambassador carefully kept his face neutral as he wiped his lips with his napkin. His eyes were alert, with the kind of focus that officials save for times when they need to carefully report something to their governments. A number of officials looked desperately at King Aldrich, hoping that he would step in and stop things from getting worse. But the king didn't move from his plate. His face was a study in studied indifference. He grabbed the stem of his wine glass with just the right amount of force to make his knuckles white, but he didn't move to stop or change the subject. He did nothing to stop the terrible motion that was building up around him, whether it was because he was shocked, thinking, or just frozen. Without moving at all, Elias stayed in place in a way that could only come from years of practice. He learned how to stand still for hours at a time while snipers tried his discipline and patience in Afghanistan. It hurt him a lot to stand at attention while blasts went off in the distance, and he didn't know if his friends were still alive or dead. This was different. Better to know. It's even worse. But the idea stayed the same. Patience without a response, honor without a reaction. The kind of quiet strength that made the Guards squad famous all over the world. Still, Camilla seemed to be getting more and more upset because of how calm he was. When Queen Camilla got up from her chair, she pushed it back so hard that it swiped across the shiny floor. The sound was sharp and jarring, very different from the careful grace that was normally present at such events. Several people jumped when they heard the noise. "This kind of disrespect won't stand," she said, and her voice could be heard in every part of the huge room, not by a soldier who cannot even follow simple bearing protocol. As soon as she took her foot off the table, her heels hit the marble hard. The sound echoed through the hall like gunshots. With each step, it looked like she was crossing lines that couldn't be undone. She was heading for a fight that would change not only the evening, but also relationships that had been built over decades. It was unclear to the 200 most powerful people in Britain and France whether they were seeing history being made or just the empire fall apart in real time. The situation seemed to be balanced on a knife's edge, ready to fall apart with just a little more stress. Elias didn't move from where he was standing for 2 hours. Now, though, his silence meant something different. He wasn't just a figure for show anymore. He had become the center around which everything else was moving toward a clash that was bound to happen. It was clear from the way the Queen Consort was moving toward him that this was no longer about the rules, ceremonies, or political niceties in ways that no one in the room could understand. This had turned very personal. Elias still didn't move. Between them and the door, Camilla took steps that sounded like hammer hits as they echoed through the huge room. Now that her face was red, the calm grace she had before had been replaced by something raw and desperate. The diplomatic mask she had worn for years was coming off, showing feelings that were supposed to be hidden by policy. She stopped right in front of him, close enough that the smell of her perfume mixed with the air of state and ceremony. It was close enough that everyone in the ballroom could see her chest rise and fall as she took 2 short, noisy breaths. "You will acknowledge me," she said in a low voice that could be heard clearly in the utter silence. "You will show respect." Elias didn't move at all. He kept his eyes straight ahead, looking through her instead of at her. He kept up the perfect military posture that he had learned over years of parade ground practice. He had a scar on his jaw that stood out against his dark skin. It was a memory of service that went far beyond military duty. The hall was ready. They held their breath as ministers. People from other countries leaned forward in their seats. Even the servers who worked along the walls looked like they were frozen in place. They knew immediately that they were seeing something that people would remember long after the night was over. Elias still didn't give her anything. There were no words, no acknowledgments, and no breaks in the calm that made up his part. He didn't stay quiet out of defiance. It was his job. The household division was the most recognized ceremonial unit in the world because everyone followed the rules to the letter. But Camilla, who was having trouble with feelings she couldn't quite name or control, thought his silence was the rudest thing he could do. It looked like he was trying to make her look bad in front of the people who should have respected her the most by refusing to break, bend, or recognize her authority. Her hand went up almost without her realizing it. It was shaking a little from the force of whatever was pushing her to this point. Everyone in the room could see the motion, and it was clear what it meant. It fell after that. As the palms hit each other, the marble cracked like a gunshot. It was loud, sudden, and echoed off the walls until the huge room was completely silent. Elias's head turned a little when it hit, but he straightened up right away and went back to his original position. His scar turned red where her hand had been, but his face didn't change. His eyes stayed on the road ahead, and his body was perfectly posed for battle. Everything changed when they went back to being still right away and wouldn't be broken, not even by physical force. The balance of power in the room changed totally in that 1 second. Even though she was standing, Camilla was shaking, and her hands were still raised. She looked small and shaky all of a sudden, and Elias, who was only marked by the physical signs of what she had done, had a quiet pride that could not be taken away by a hit. There was more than shock in the guests' combined gasp before they spoke. It was the sound of people seeing an institution get hurt right in front of them. Diplomats from other countries would write reports about this event. In the halls of Parliament, ministers would talk about it in whispers. However, the man who had been quiet throughout the whole argument said the most important thing: Aldrich the King. After the hit, the hall was silent for a long time. The only sound was the steady crackle of the candle flames in the candelabras. 200 of the most powerful people in the world did not move at all. It seemed like even breathing too loudly could break the fragile quiet. Queen Camilla stood still, her hand shaking and her face red from realizing what she had just done in front of people from all over the world. She wasn't happy, though. She was scared. Then, at last, King Aldrich got up. Even though the movement was slow and intentional, it had a weight that made everyone in the room look. There was a sound that seemed much louder than it should have, when his chair slapped back against the marble. It punctuated the moment like an inevitable drumbeat. The change was shocking when Aldrich stood at his full height. Just a moment ago, he was another person at the table, smiling happily at stories and toasting partnerships. Now he seemed to be the kingdom itself. Hundreds of years of power distilled into a single man whose presence filled the huge room. It was cold for the French minister, even though he was an old pro. The British officials stood up straight because they knew that when the king spoke, the whole country spoke through him. Along the walls, everyone, even the servers, seemed to stand more still and alert. Aldrich looked at his wife first. It wasn't anger or sadness that made his face burn. It was something colder, something that made you think about math and carefully weighing the pros and cons. After that, he looked at Elias. Everyone in the room knew what was at stake at that very moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but it echoed through the whole room. He said, "Corporal Wetherford," with each word clear and measured. "Did you speak a word during this banquet?" After that, there was complete silence. Elias did not move at all. His eyes were set straight ahead. When he finally spoke, it was in a quiet but strong voice with the steady beat of a soldier. "No, Your Majesty." For a long time, the king looked at him with a gaze that seemed to test the man's very soul. Then Aldrich turned back to the guests who were still there. His voice was now higher, giving it the clear power of a king or queen. "Then let it be known to this company," he said, that this man has upheld his duty with honor, dignity, and restraint, even in the face of unprovoked insult. There was a wave of emotion in the crowd. Some people were relieved, others were shocked, but everyone felt like they were seeing something important. The French delegates looked at each other in ways that showed both respect and cunning. Everyone among the British politicians seemed to let out a sigh of relief, but no one dared to move or speak. Aldrich looked down the hall and fixed each person in place. "The honor of this crown does not depend on fear or the shame of those who serve it," he said, his voice steady but stern. "It rests upon justice, upon restraint, and upon the knowledge that authority must never be wielded as a weapon against the loyal." He then slowly and carefully turned back to face Camilla. As night fell, there was more silence than before. It was so full of expectation that it was almost painful. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. At her side, her hand, the same hand that hit the guard, was clearly shaking. At that point, everyone in the room could see that the kingdom was no longer defined by what she did, but by what he said. The whole hall seemed to hold itself in place for a heartbeat, waiting, listening, and bracing. King Aldrich looked at Camilla and didn't say a word for a long time. When he did, it was like a million stones falling into a still pond, making waves that no one would ever forget. "Camilla," he said, going with her name instead of her title on purpose. The error was more painful than any yelling correction. The ministers tensed up around the table. Foreign leaders across the room looked at each other with eyes as sharp as blades. Aldrich continued, his voice steady and clear. "You have struck not only a soldier, but the very principle on which this crown stands, that those who serve it do so with honor and should be honored in return." When Camilla opened her mouth, Aldrich raised his hand, but only 2 fingers. The move stopped her in her tracks, and stopped any response she tried to make. He turned a little to look at everyone in the room and said, "There are witnesses here from across our realm and across the seas. They have seen this man remain steadfast under humiliation, while others faltered. They have seen our institutions tested before their eyes, and they shall leave here knowing that the honor of this nation does not break under the hand of impulse." The guests began to murmur, which could mean agreement or even respect. The French minister almost imperceptibly cocked his head, which is a sign of respect for how serious the situation was. Aldrich looked at Elias again. "Corporal Wetherford." The soldier's voice replied right away, calm and steady, "Your Majesty, you have done your duty tonight beyond measure. You stood unbroken where others might have faltered. Know that your king has seen it, and that your service honors not only your regiment, but the crown itself." Elias let himself make the tiniest movement for the first time that night. It was just a slight bow of the head, but it had more weight than any words. The hall erupted in quiet agreement. At first there was soft, polite applause, but it grew as dignitaries and ministers realized how important and safe it was to show support. Even though the string quartet didn't know what their part was, they struck a respectful chord that seemed to emphasize the moment. But Aldrich wasn't done yet. He now lowered his voice a little, not because it wasn't strong enough, but to make it more sharp. He looked straight at Camilla, who was pale and shaking in front of him. "As for you," he said, his words purposeful, "know this, the authority of a crown rests not upon the trappings of rank, but upon restraint and upon wisdom. When that is forgotten, when the hand is raised against loyalty itself, then it is not the servant who is diminished, it is the sovereign." The hall felt heavy with the weight of what he said. Camilla's lips were shaking. She quickly looked around the room for support, but all she saw were carefully blank faces. No one was brave enough to look her in the eyes for long. Not only did she make herself look bad, she made them all look bad too. Aldrich's voice got softer, but it still had a steely quality to it. "You will retire from this hall," he added, "and you will reflect upon what it means to bear the weight of a nation's trust. Until then, you will hold no public engagements in the name of this crown." It was like a decision when they came out. While not quite exile or deportation, this was clearly a public scolding in front of the whole world. Camilla's body showed that she was shocked by the sudden movement. It took a butler some time to quietly lead her out of the room and she fought him for a heartbeat before giving in. The doors shut behind her with a sound that sounded like it was the end. Aldrich looked back at the guests. Even though his face softened, it was clear that he was tired from just keeping his organization from falling apart. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his glass, "let us return to our purpose. Tonight we honor friendship between nations and the service of those who stand guard over it." Elias stayed totally still and listened. No longer did the red mark on his face look like shame, but it was still there. It looked like a sign of toughness. The party went on, but everyone there knew that the kingdom would never be the same again. The next morning, newspapers all over Europe had different versions of the same title. A guard, a queen, and a crown. The slap at St. James's. While some newspapers called it a scandal and others called it a show, almost all of them agreed on one thing. Something significant had happened in that dark hall. The monarchy's honor had not been protected by pomp, ceremony, or tradition for the first time in live memory. Instead, it had been protected by the steady authority of a king who would not let silence destroy him and the unwavering resolve of a single soldier. Of course, the video got out. In the gallery, a phone that was put out of sight caught the Queen Consort hitting Elias with her hand, capturing his unbroken posture and the king's reprimand that followed. 1 million people had watched the movie by dawn. Commentators argued about what it meant with a sense of urgency. "A shame for the crown, or a moment of truth?" asked one piece of paper. Someone else said, "The guard who stood taller than royalty." Finally, and most movingly, what is monarchy if not honor in battle? Most people in the public felt sorry for Elias. Veterans groups said nice things about how calm he was. Reporters from other countries said that his calmness had, ironically, made Britain look better in other countries. Some people who were against the government had to admit that King Aldrich's actions had prevented what could have been a disaster for the whole world. As for Camilla, she stopped being seen by the public. Official statements said she was away for a period of private reflection, but that didn't change the truth. She had been silenced, her power taken away, and her reputation damaged. Some people inside the palace were speculating, but people outside and in Parliament were almost relieved that she wasn't there. What about Elias? The next week, he was called to Buckingham in private. Aldrich wore a medal on his chest that wasn't for battle, but for honor and dignity. These medals are only given to people whose service went beyond the call of duty. The king's words were short, but everyone there would remember them. "Sometimes, Corporal, a nation rests not upon armies, but upon the stillness of one man who refuses to bend. Last week you were that man." Elias bowed, didn't say anything, and went back to his army. He didn't want to be interviewed or make public comments, and he stayed away from the sudden wave of praise that had made him a reluctant national figure for a short time. But his quiet was stronger than any words he spoke. People often talked about that night, when they talked about how the monarchy survived in a time when every institution was being questioned. That night was when a queen lost her cool, a soldier kept his cool, and a king rose to remember everyone that the crown's last defense was its dignity.